Prahanda Sitachi. My name is Carl. Welcome to my Lingo Kingdom, where I am learning the languages of the Isles. Specifically, Japanese, yes, but also Gaelic and Cymraeg. If you've learned any type of Celtic language, like Welsh or Gaelic or Irish, then you've probably noticed a lot of loanwords from English which are in those languages. Even Japanese, which I've also been learning, has a ton, at this point, a ton of English loanwords. But how have these ancient Celtic languages that were being spoken in the British Isles long before Anglo-Saxons came to the island, how did those languages affect the language that we now speak, called English? To answer that question, I'm going to be reviewing part of a video today by Let Them Talk TV, which is a YouTube channel run by a great British bloke called Gideon, where he teaches people all about English, and especially how to speak English. He's going to kind of give us a linguistic journey through how Celtic languages over time have influenced the English language. So I'm going to leave a link down to his original video down below. I encourage you to go watch the whole thing. I'm going to be jumping into the video at the point where he starts to talk about what we now think of as Celtic peoples in Britain, which is generally thought of to be the bell beaker culture during the Bronze Age. If you thought that it was the Celts that built Stonehenge, you can go and watch his video, and at the beginning he'll kind of challenge that myth for you. Alright, take it away, Gideon.
Ancient DNA records show us that a new migration from around 2800 BC took place, which almost completely replaced the Neolithic populations. These were the bell beaker peoples, so called because of their beakers, which are distinct types of pottery discovered on archaeological sites across Europe.
Shout out to my bell beakers.
Mostly had Central European ancestry with lighter skin than the Neolithic peoples. 90% of Britain's Neolithic gene pool was replaced with the coming of the beaker people. With the beakers...
Side note, bell beakers. He might talk about this. I'm not sure. I've not really watched the video. The bell beaker people is also brought with them their Y haplogroup, their kind of Y chromosome group, which a lot of people in Britain now have, and including me, a descendant of people who came from Britain. It's called R1b. I've been thinking about doing some videos about Celtic DNA, and especially how you can test your DNA if you're interested in that sort of thing. So if you are interested in that sort of thing and you want me to do a video about that, then write in the comments down below Celtic DNA. I don't know what you're talking about.
Came the Bronze Age. They used copper and bronze tools and implements. What language did they speak? Once again, there are no written records. It's mostly conjecture. However, we do get some clues from the names of rivers and other natural features on the landscape. For example, the River Thames that runs through London, does that cognate with the word for dark in Latvian or Lithuanian and other older Indo-European languages, or is it just a coincidence? Some linguists have hypothesized that the bell beaker spoke a language that was the common ancestor of both the Italo and Celtic language groups. There is also a theory that they may have spoken an ancestor of Basque, a non-Indo-European language.
So I've heard the kind of Basque theory before, but I'm not convinced by that. I think the Basques could be similar to, genetically, to some of the other, like the Mesolithic or Neolithic populations that he talks about earlier in the video, but as far as the Bronze Age and the bell beaker folk, on the Atlantic seaboard, I don't think they would be similar to Basques, according to my limited layperson understanding.
Which is spoken far more widely than it is today. It has also been postulated that the bell beakers spoke an Indo-European language that is now extinct. And finally, perhaps they didn't speak one language. Bell beaker tribes may have spoken different languages. We will never know for certain, but the DNA evidence gives us yet another clue. They originated from the Pontic Caspian steppe around 3000 BC.
Yep. I wonder if he's going to talk about the Yamnaya culture, because the Yamnaya culture out of the kind of Caspian steppe, according to this theory of Celtic origins, because there's several. According to this theory, it'd be the Yamnaya, which then gave rise to later, the Belbeker and the Hallstatt and all these other types of, subcultures, which later became a lot of the ethnic groups that are now in, Western Europe.
Where Proto-European was spoken, which supports an Indo-European language hypothesis. From about the 7th century BC, Celtic tribes arrived in Britain. Note that at this time, the Celtic peoples ruled great swathes of Europe.
I'm curious how he's going to talk about this, because like I mentioned, there's several different theories about Celtic origins, and this is one of them. This is kind of the Hallstatt theory, kind of that the culture, spread out of this area in, kind of near Germany and Switzerland, and then kind of spread. He says that the Celts arrived, and he makes the differentiation between the Belbeekers and the Celts. I'm not sure if that's accurate. I think that's up for debate. One of the theories that I've heard is that, you've got the Belbeekers, and they're, definitely the gene pool that's there, but then the Celtic culture is the one. The Celtic culture and language is what later spreads through contact. So it's not like there were Belbeker people and then they were killed by Celtic people. It's more like the Belbeker people were there, and they either they spoke a form of language, kind of like the Italo-Celtic or a Proto-Celtic, and then later what we distinguish as later on being firmly, kind of traditionally Celtic was something that spread and developed later on in those same people groups. So I'm not sure which is right. It could be a little both, but we'll see. I just think it's really interesting, and I love that Gideon is going, into such detail here, so that we can see not only how these things influenced the English that we speak now, but also kind of the history behind it.
Now, the traditional view was that the Celts conquered the country, replacing the Belbeker population.
Yeah, that's
recent
kind of what I was talking
DNA
about.
evidence shows that this was not the case.
Hey.
Likely took control in a more gradual fashion and mingled with the Belbeker populations, who, over time, adopted Celtic technologies, farming methods, and language. The Celts spoke a Proto-Celtic language at that time, and that later diverged into...
Moment of silence for the lost Pictish language. I mean, Hadrian's Wall. Picts, where it didn't happen. I wish Pictish was still around, and I wish we knew more about what the Picts actually spoke. But I'm doing some research right now for a video about the history of Gaelic, and one of the big things is kind of the Pictish influence and how that all played out with the Gaels and the Picts.
The Brittonic languages of Welsh, Cornish, Cumbric, and Breton language spoken in present-day Brittany now. Another branch of Celtic languages called Gaelic probably came across from Ireland, and these languages include Gaelic, Irish, and Manx.
Yep.
For several hundred years, the Celts remained the dominant force on the islands of Britain. They spread their culture and language, but their rule would come to an end in 43 AD.
Now, I do want to mention, before he gets to the Romans, because I think that's what he's about to talk about, is that, we're talking about kind of like, the Celts. And it's like, the Celts did this. And it's like, well, really, it was a bunch of different tribes, who shared a common ancestry and culture and, language. But they definitely thought of themselves as individual tribes. And they were kind of fighting each other and, intermarrying with each other and having different little, areas that they controlled, much like the later Native American tribes here. There's a lot of them where the different tribes are nearby, but they all kind of have a similar language and a similar culture, depending on how close they are to each other geographically. So, historically, we look backwards and say, oh, they're all Celts. We put them under this umbrella, but they probably wouldn't have thought of themselves as that. They would say, oh, I'm Burgundies, or I'm Silures, or I'm Caledonian, things like that.
When the Romans invaded,
The Romans.
Garrisons remained in Britain until 410 AD. During the Roman era, in some parts of Britain, especially the south and east, a variety of Latin called British Latin was spoken. In the rest of Britain, they continued to speak a Celtic language. In other parts of Europe, which formed part of...
And you can actually see that even today in a lot of the Latin influences on Welsh, which we still have today. Of course, a lot of people by this point are familiar with the Latin influence on English, especially via medieval French with the rule of the Normans and everything. But I think it's also worth pointing out that there's also been some linguistic borrowing from Latin into Welsh. So just like the Celtic languages have influenced English, there's also these other languages which have influenced the Celtic languages. So it goes both ways.
Of the Roman Empire, a language descended from Latin is spoken there until this day. Spanish, French, Portuguese, Catalan, Romanian, but not in Britain. The reason is that when the Romans left Britain, other invaders from Germanic tribes on the continent, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the others, and sometimes the Vikings from Scandinavia, they came across, and English is descended from these languages. Most linguists believe that modern English is derived from anglo-saxon, but there is a minority opinion that argues that English is a Scandinavian language. For more on that, watch my outstanding video on how the Vikings influenced the English language.
Yeah, we definitely got some loan words in English from the Norse language family as well. I think words like thing, is a Scandinavian word originally. Thing. I do have one quibble here, and that is that it kind of talks about the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians as being invaders, and there's some extent to which that was true, but that's kind of a way people used to think about it, like 50, 100 years ago, and now, given more of the DNA evidence and archaeological evidence that we have, it's more so that there was some invasion. There were some people who would come and attack, but it was much more of a slow kind of migration type thing. There were battles. There were times when, the Germanic people, would come over and they would, conquer and kill. But it seems like a lot of it was more of just a migration of an elite because of the social hierarchy of that elite that kind of made the rest of the people around them start to speak Old English or kind of, Old German. Rather than all of the native Britons being, killed out and completely replaced by these Germanic peoples. It's like, no, it's more like just some of them came and they started to intermarry and their culture took over. And a lot of the people, even in that area, still have a lot of Celtic ancestry from the native Britons. So not really an invasion like it used to be thought of.
The Romans were in Britain for some 400 years, and it is estimated that around 800 words of Latin origin can be found in the Breton languages.
Hey, I kind of mentioned that earlier, didn't I?
Welsh. And Cornish. However, because we got a whole new people entering the country after the Romans left, and therefore the vocabulary of English is descended from these new invaders and not the indigenous peoples. Few words of Latin origin have been passed down and have been continuously used in Britain since Roman times. Probably the words cheese and street, not much more.
Cheese and street.
Latin words that entered the English language came after the Romans left, especially after the Norman conquest.
Yep, I was talking about that too.
So what about the Anglo-Saxons? And what has this got to do with the Celts and the English language? Well, let me explain. The traditional view has been that when the Anglo-Saxon tribes arrived in Britain in the 5th century onwards, they swept across England and defeated or perhaps massacred the Celts who stood in their way. Celts were pushed to the western fringes of England
And yeah.
To Wales, to Cornwall, and many took flight and crossed the sea to Brittany, where a Celtic language, Breton, is still spoken to this day. Although it's true that Celtic languages were marginalised, the story of the Celts being annihilated in the areas occupied by the anglo-saxons isn't borne out by the DNA evidence.
All right. See? So I just got to let him cook, and he'll get there, and he'll get to exactly what I was saying. Yeah. Right on, Gideon. We are on the same page, sir.
Because you would expect to find that to this day, the DNA of people in Wales and Cornwall would differ from those parts of Anglo-Saxon England from where the Celts were driven out or killed. But it doesn't, not to any significant degree. This would imply a much more gradual change where the local Celtic populations mostly stayed put and assimilated to the culture and language of the invaders.
Yes, that is totally correct. And I would say at the most, if you go to, say, Essex or Sussex or some of those, or East Anglia, those areas where there was a heavy concentration of Anglo-Saxon kind of invaders, even today, the most autosomal DNA you'll find there in the population is like 40%, and that's high. Celts are still around. Most of them just speak English now, and so that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to reclaim the Celtic languages as well, because it's not only do I find it so fascinating, but it's a part of history that I don't want us to lose. So my ancestors spoke English, and so I speak English, and so I want to speak some of the other things that they also spoke, like Gaelic and Welsh.
This is very important when looking at the influence of Celtic on the English language, which will become apparent shortly. The traditional view holds that since the Celtic people were pushed away, they had zero impact on the English language except for a few place names, a few dialect words, and a very small number that entered the English language proper. In The Story of English by Robert McCrum et al., they say the English language has been indifferent to the Celts and their influence. But this is incorrect. Let's have a look at this in more detail. Here are a few words of Celtic origin in English. The list is small, and even some on this list are disputed, and it's complicated further by the fact that the Anglo-Saxons had a number of Celtic words in their vocabularies they brought over when they invaded Britain, words that they had assimilated through contact with Celtic tribes on the European mainland.
Gauls.
This includes words such as down. And yet more Celtic words came into English via Norman French, the anglo-norman, which had quite a number of words of Gaulish origin. Gaulish was a Celtic language spoken in France. Ambassador, corps, and peace came from Gaulish via anglo-norman. Car.
That is so interesting. I knew that. I guess I knew in theory that there must have been some Gaulish loanwords that made their way into French, like the French language, but I had never thought about how that would have then influenced the Normans, Middle French, and how they brought that into, Middle English, and then how that influenced modern English. And I definitely didn't know that even Old German, kind of the Anglo-Saxon language or language family, had some Celtic kind of flurries in there as well. Or as my friend Ben Llewellyn likes to say, with Gaulish sprinkles.
English is when Welsh-speaking Britons became Germanic peasants, ruled over by French snobs and psychopaths with Viking sprinkles.
Was the name Gauls gave to their chariots. It is estimated there are about 500 Celtic words in modern French. Even the way the French use numbers, 80 is 80 in France, and that's literally 4 20s, and 90 is 90. 4, 20 and 10. And this is how the Celts used to count. So there's a lot of Celtic family in French. However, Celtic influence on the French language is beyond the scope of this video. So let's...
I know it's beyond the scope, but man, I'm glad you mentioned it, Gideon, because that was really interesting. I did not know. Je ne sais pas.
Let's return to English. Now, words English gets directly from Brittonic languages is indeed small. Bard, as in poet. Shakespeare is also known as the Bard of Stratford. It could come from Welsh, Gaelic or Cornish. The Welsh word is
Bard.
Hog.
Yeah, bardd. Bardd.
I'm a bit Welsh myself, as you can plainly tell from my sonorously lilting tones.
It's spelled the same in Gaelic, but it's actually pronounced barsht. On Gaelic, barsht.
Meaning a pig, crumpet. Yes, those cakes here, a staple English food for many centuries, might come from the Welsh.
Crimpog.
Iron is probably a Celtic word, possibly from Cornish. The Welsh word is
Yarn.
lawn, from Welsh.
Sam.
A few words English gets from Gaelic, from the contact with the people in Scotland. These include the word galore, which means a lot of something, usually used in the positive.
I actually made a video about this, about some of the Gaelic loanwords that are in English. And I'll put a link to that at the end of the video as well.
For example, gob, which means the beak of an animal. Gob in English is an informal word for your mouth. Shut your gob, you may hear that expression, a bit rude. Or you might hear gobsmacked, which means extremely surprised. So for example, when I found out that I smashed the world record, I was gobsmacked.
That is interesting how when a word, jumps to a different language, it can take on a slightly different meaning. So here it's saying that Irish, gob, it means beak. But it's used in English to refer to mouth. Well, I mean, Gaelic has a word for mouth, beal. But the fact that they took the word for beak and turned it into a colloquialism for mouth is interesting. Kind of similar, but not quite the same,
Gobsmacked. And whiskey,
Vishkapaya.
that means water of life.
Yes.
Not much more, I'm afraid. A few more obscure and specialist words, and some other common words where the origin is disputed, a case of maybe they are, maybe they're not. And those words would include bin and brat and penguin.
Penguin?
Penguins.
Inchinoch.
However, many place names across Britain are derived from Celtic.
Yes.
And
This is...
includes the names.
Now we're getting on more solid ground. Pun not intended. Surprising.
Of 2/3 of Britain's rivers. The River Avon. Avon means river, so River Avon is in fact river. Derwent, Trent, Tees, Tyne. Although some river names, such as the Thames, may have predated Celts, as we've already seen. Pen meant a hill, and that gives us Penrith, Penge, and Penistone. Yes, it's pronounced Penistone. You remember that I said that recent DNA evidence showed that the Celtic people mostly remained where they were throughout England and integrated with the anglo-saxon tribes. And we can assume that the conquered Celts would have adopted the language of the invaders.
Now, I know we talked about this again, but conquered, I think is the wrong word there. But I know he's oversimplifying. He's talked about how it wasn't really a conquering, in all instances. It was more of a migration and intermingling and progressed over time, where the two groups kind of merged and formed a new, identity. So I know he's oversimplifying and he's already addressed this. I'm just reiterating that. Because I'm pedantic.
Perhaps they spoke Celtic at home, but the lingua franca for most of the country was English. What happens when you speak a foreign language, but you know it less well than your native language? You've probably experienced this, either yourself speaking a foreign language or hearing a non-native struggling to speak your language.
This is so true. This is so true. If you try to learn any language at all, then you know that. Even if you know the words, you put them in the wrong order, it'll be like, oh, I think I know what that's supposed to mean, but that's not right.
They use grammar, syntax, speech patterns from their own language. So I'll give you an example. In French, if you want to say you're hungry, you say j'ai faim. Literally, I have hunger. But an English person says, I am hungry. I am hungry. When I started learning French, I'm sure I said many times, je suis femme, which means I am a woman. Another mistake English learners do is to pronounce the end of the word. So it's femme, hungry, not femme, woman. Other less embarrassing but equally confusing to a native French speaker is when an English speaker says, j'ai allé, I have gone. Oh, the French don't say like that. They say, je suis allé, I am gone. So you see where I'm getting with this, don't you? The constant use of incorrect grammar by the Celts over time seeped into the way we spoke English. Now let's see how. The meaningless do. Now if English is not your first language, then perhaps you've noticed that there is a strange thing about do. Did you see the panda bear at the zoo? Why do we say it like that? Why don't we say, saw you, the panda bear? That's how most other European languages do it. We put the main verb in the past tense, but that's not how we do it anymore. Do you like strawberries? What is it with this do? Why can't we just say, like you strawberries? Isn't that easier? Isn't that more logical? In negatives too. I don't believe you. Why don't we just say, I believe you not?
I believe you not. It reminds me of like farming in Lord of the Rings. I cannot.
I cannot.
This is what John McWhorter calls the meaningless do. Why is it there? Do doesn't do anything. Strange, and yet it's there all the time. Now,
Do doesn't do anything, translated into my native Southern, would be do don't do nothing.
Now, McWhorter and other linguists have studied hundreds of other languages, and they find nothing similar in any other language except one. Have you guessed it, Sherlock? Yes, that's right. It's our neighbour Welsh, and its sister language Gaelic. So I guess that makes two. Is it a coincidence? Well, it seems highly unlikely. In English, sometimes you have an inserted do, which does have a function. There you are, that's a good example of it. Let me give you another. I do hope that when you finish watching this, you'll watch some of my other groundbreaking videos. Yes, I do know the difference between marsupials and guacamole. So these do's, do hope, do know, etc., are not the same because it emphasizes a sentence.
Yeah, it's very emphatic.
It's called the emphatic do. It is not a meaningless do because it's used.
You can tell I used to be an English tutor.
So it has a purpose. However, go back into history, go back to Shakespeare's time, and the do or does or a dust or doth gets added here or there to an affirmative sentence. Thou little knowest how thou dost startle me. If thou dost find him tractable to us, encourage him and show him all our reasons.
Dost.
And often these do's or dusts were meaningless. Yes, they may have given rhythm to the verse, but they serve no other function. We use the meaningless do in questions and negatives. And guess what? Welsh and Cornish use a meaningless do in questions.
Do you have an example
and negatives.
from Welsh?
Here are some examples.
Thank you, thank
I
you.
open the door.
Wnes i agor y drws.
Did I open the door?
Wnes i agor y drws.
I didn't open the door.
Wnes i ddim agor y drws.
This wnes means did. And notice the difference between modern English and Welsh is that in Welsh, the meaningless do is also used in affirmative sentences, in past tenses. And even though we don't say it today, it's exactly as it was used in Elizabethan times in examples we looked at from Shakespeare earlier. When did the meaningless do come about in English? Old English did not use do in this fashion. It only started appearing in Middle English. There is no meaningless do in Old English. That is until 1066. In fact,
That is surprising to me. Especially given everything we've talked to up until this point, with the idea of, you know, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes and Frisians, you know, kind of moving in and that becoming the status language. And like he said, people probably spoke, you know, Brettonic at home, and then when they were out and trading, they would speak Old English. So the fact that these Celtic elements are not in Old English makes me then doubt that theory. Or at least doubt that the mechanism was that immediate. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that could hint to, you know, kind of a common Brettonic still being spoken at home for more generations, so that it still has influence up until the Norman invasion when you start to get, you know, Middle English. But there's an issue with that too, because by the time you get to that, Middle English itself is being influenced by Middle French. That's how we get the whole, you know, the Norman, you know, conquest and all of these Latin forms and French forms when words coming into Middle English, and almost like this class difference between different types of words. That's why you have multiple types of words. This is the classic example of, you know, pig for the animal and pork for the meat, or cow for the animal and beef for the meat. The beef comes from French and the cow is from the German, the Old English. So it seems like there's several layers then between Middle English and the original kind of Brettonic. So I'm really curious about the mechanism there. And this makes me think especially that I really do need to do a video kind of about how this would have happened, and kind of I've always wondered why there was this disconnect between all of the people still mostly staying the same in England and other parts of the UK, but then the culture changing so rapidly and moving into an Old English type culture, and kind of how that happened and the effects that would have had on each one. So this is kind of further exacerbated that question, and now I'm even more curious as to how this would have happened.
So we don't see it at all until the Middle English period. Chaucer used it once in the Canterbury Tales. Fader, why do ye weep? 1387. And he probably used it for a little local colour, as it wasn't standard English at that time. However, and this is revealing, as it shows that it was characteristic of the local English, but hadn't yet entered the mainstream. Here is an early reference to it in 1451. I hope ye shall be at home so soon that I will do write no more tidings to yow. By the early 16th century, it was commonplace, as was noted by Palsgrave in 1530. I do is a verb much commonly used in our tongue to be put before other verbs, as it is all one to say, I do speak and I speak. If the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons were
Here's my
indeed
question.
sitting at the same benches drinking chalices of mead together from the 5th century, why did it take 1,000 years for it to enter the English language? McWalter explains that from the Norman invasion in 1066, French was the language of the aristocracy. This was so for 300 years.
Yep.
The second language of England at that time was Latin. So English was relegated to 3rd place in its own country. Not much English was written down at that time. If it had been, we would have had examples from regional dialects of the southwest, and eventually this meaningless did enter the English language in the early 16th century.
Well, that's super interesting, but I don't think that answers my question. Now, there's probably been entire books written about the subject, and I just need to find them and read them, as well as academic articles, journal articles. In fact, I've got one that I really want to make a video about, because I've not read it yet, called Why Doesn't England Speak Welsh Everywhere, is kind of the gist of the journal article. So this is definitely something that I want to continue to learn about. I hope that this has been as interesting for you as it has been for me, because I've held off watching this video for a long time because I wanted to experience it with y'all in real time. Like I mentioned, if you want to kind of dive more into this, not only should you go watch Gideon's original video here, if you want to go watch that and some of his other videos, definitely check that out. And also, if you'd like to learn some more about all of the Gaelic words that entered into English, I've got some more in another video that he did not mention in this one, and you can watch that video right up here.